everyone, this is Carlos Garrido from Midwestern Marx. Today I want to talk to you about Socrates, and specifically the death of Socrates, or better yet, the killing of Socrates. It's a video that's in line with an article that I have recently published titled "The Real Reason Why They Killed Socrates and Why Class Society Must Whitewash His Death." So, the figure of Socrates is a central figure in the history of philosophy. He never actually wrote anything. He was actually against writing because he conceived of writing and reading as an easy way for us to lose our capacity to remember and actively have to sustain ideas. We felt like if ideas are just put down in books, then our memory sort of shifts towards being in books. But the figure of Socrates is picked up by Plato, who was a student of his, who Socrates is killed when Plato is quite young, but nonetheless the figure of Socrates is central for Plato, and Plato recaptures this figure and uses him as the protagonist of all of his dialogues. So for those of you that don't know, Plato writes in dialogues, and the central figure in these dialogues, the figure through which Plato's philosophy emerges through, is Socrates, who is his teacher. Now, Socrates is killed in 399 BCE by the Athenian state. His trial takes place in February 15, and shortly after he is killed. His death, there's only one, to the best of my knowledge at least, there's only one primary source on his death, which is from precisely Plato, and it comes from a dialogue which is structured as a narrative of the case, where Socrates gives his speeches, and in one moment he has what we come to know as, with other works of Plato as the Socratic method. So the questioning sort of dialogue, he has this with Meletus, but besides that is basically the speech of Socrates to the audience on the day of his trial. So that's the only primary source we have, and I have a cool little gem that I want to show. Let's see if the camera can capture it nicely. The Trial of Socrates. It's from this old little publisher called, quite literally, Little Leather Library. It's really nice, but look, the Trial of Socrates. It's also known as the Apology. But this is the only primary source we have. There was another student of Socrates that wrote about it. The title of that one was also The Trial of Socrates, but it was the Trial of Socrates to the Jury. And that one comes from a student of his called Xenophon. Xenophon also has other writings that are important and often overlooked. But Xenophon wasn't actually in Athens when the trial took place, and because he wasn't in Athens, technically his source is a secondary source. So what we have as far as narrative on the trial is really Plato's Apology, which is written shortly after Plato's being present at the trial. Now, why talk about this? What's the practical purpose of talking about this? I found that there's two purposes as to why I took up the analysis of the death of Socrates and why it's meaningful for today. The first one is that it shows us, in analyzing what I consider to be the real reason why he's killed, we recapture a figure in Socrates that helps us in giving us tools to provide normative critiques of capitalism. Now, I know we have more than enough of those already. That's the easiest thing to do. The easiest thing to possibly do is criticize capitalism normatively. That's the beauty of scientific socialism. It allows you to understand it scientifically and to understand it more systematically. But nonetheless, it's a normative critique from one of the biggest minds in the history of civilization, or at least Western civilization. The second point is that it shows how even in these points of supposed neutrality, these points that are just in relation to a philosophical event that took place, you say 400 years before Christ's death, so almost 2400 years ago now. It shows how these events still have to be mediated in such a way so that they do not become a antagonistic event in relationship to capital and specifically, more generally, class society. So I've been sort of beating around the bush. Let me explain to you what the problem is. So Socrates is killed, and since the death of Socrates, most of the general readings that have been given about his death that one finds in introductory textbooks, I have here the I don't have the classical one, it's in the other room, but these W.T. Jones introductory textbooks, which I used a lot when I was an undergrad, or some of the other ones. And introductory textbooks, introductory videos, introductory classroom lectures about this dialogue and about Socrates' death, you get a narrative that Socrates is killed because he's someone that challenges religion. Some people say that he challenges it as an atheist. Others say that he challenges as a spiritualist that believes in new divinities and rejects the dogmas of the existing gods of the state. But they generally reduce the message of Socrates and the reason why he's killed to religious reasons. And having this semester to study the Apology closely in order to teach it, I found that this general reading that I had, because it was transmitted to me through all of these other sources, this general reading on the death of Socrates was quite wrong. And not only was it wrong, but any reading of the text will show that it's clearly wrong. Socrates himself says twice that a reading like this would be wrong. He doesn't say a reading, but you can infer from it that he's saying any sort of reading of my trial as concluding that my death is because of these reasons would be generally false. He doesn't say it like that, but we can infer from it. So, as I mentioned, the dialogue is really a recapitulation of what happens at the trial. And Socrates begins by making a distinction between his old and new accusers. It's a secret milk-like substance that we're drinking on a Friday night. He starts by making a distinction between his old and new accusers. From the start, he recognizes that his old accusers are more dangerous, first by the simple fact that because they're old accusers, they've been around long enough to socialize people into believing what they say about Socrates. So he gives us a quick snippet of what it is that the old accusers say, and he says, and this is a direct quote basically, they say that Socrates makes the better appear the worst cause. He makes the better appear the worst cause. What does this mean? Well, that Socrates takes what is generally considered as good and he makes it appear as bad. This is an inversion, right? He flips what's good on its head and he makes what's good appear bad. Now, the problem is that he doesn't say in the dialogue yet what is the content of that inversion. From what he says about their accusations, you can tell that there's an inversion, but you don't know what the content of the inversion is yet. What he does directly after mentioning that inversion is giving us the reasons why he's hated. To do so, he gives the story of his friend who went to the oracle in Delphi and asked the oracle, who's the wisest person in Athens? The oracle said Socrates. Socrates doesn't believe this. He understands himself to not know anything, and therefore he goes around questioning everyone. In the dialogue, he questions politicians, artists, and artisans, so everyday workers, craft workers. And he finds that the reason why he's the wisest person in Athens is because he knows that he doesn't know anything. Whereas other people think that they know, but in reality they don't really know anything. So this knowledge of the self-ignorance is at least more knowledge than a knowledge that is really a demonstration of ignorance, especially that is shown once that knowledge is questioned, which is how he was able to see the ignorance behind the politician, the artist, or the poet specifically, and the artisans. So this is probably the most memorable message that comes about from the Apology. When philosophers generally cite the Apology, this is one of the most important parts they cite, which is that Socrates shows this sort of Socratic humility, that I know that I don't know anything, and that's why I'm the wisest in Athens. But Socrates gives us this story of his friend, and he explains to us, well, what happened in that time? Well, I was questioning these different sorts of people that society generally considers to be wise, and in that process of questioning, I was getting them annoyed. They were beginning to hate me because I was showing to them and to the youth that was observing my process of questioning, I was showing them that those who society considers to have certain sorts of knowledges don't really have them, because as soon as they start being questioned, their ignorance shows. So he describes that as the reason why he has the enemies, which are the reason why he's in the court in the first place today. And it's also the reason why the youth is following him, because they find it appealing and entertaining to see Socrates in his process of questioning. And he also mentions that some of the younger people have taken up the method and used it against these other wise people and have made them embarrass themselves in similar ways. Now, this is great and all. This is a very important part of the dialogue, and this is great to take up because it presents that spirit of questioning that we see in an early Marx, right? Marx has the famous letter to, I believe it's Arnold Rouge, where he explains his philosophical duty as the critical examination of all things existing. So don't accept any dogma, question everything, right? And this is the same Socratic spirit that is shown in this process of interrogating a series of people. But in that intermedium, by which he tells us the story, that initial point about the reason why the old accusers accuse him of making the better appear the worse cause is not yet answered. Instead of answering it now, he goes into the new accusers, and he begins the Socratic method of questioning with Meletus. Meletus is the person, at least in the dialogue, that's demonstrated as the lead in the charge of atheism. So at first, Meletus and Anytus and some of the new accusers are accusing him of moving the youth away from the divinities of the state or from the gods of the state towards new divinities and spiritualities. So he begins questioning Meletus, and in the process of questioning, Meletus is forced to admit that no, that Socrates is actually an atheist, that he doesn't believe in the gods. So Socrates just completely destroys him. He leaves him in what is known as the state of Aporia, which is this sort of state of confusion that comes about after Socrates questions you into not even knowing what you said in the first place or contradicting yourself, which is what Meletus ends up doing. And Socrates even says in the dialogue that Meletus contradicts himself to the point of him being able to come into the courtroom and say, I charge Socrates of not believing in the gods and of at the same time believing in them. So he's able to get him to contradict himself. And after he says that, he once again right? Remember, at first he said that the most dangerous ones are the older ones for so-and-so reasons. Now he says it again. Now he says, look, I will be considered guilty not because of the accusations of Meletus, Anytus, or of the new accusers. So this narrative that is what's hegemonized in the telling of the death of Socrates, which is that he dies because of religious reasons, is admitted by Socrates to not be the reason why he dies. He understands very well that it is not Meletus or the new accusers, the ones that are charging him for atheism, that are the ones that are ultimately going to be responsible for him being charged guilty. He understands that very well. So why would philosophy have this general notion that reduces his death to religious reasons? Well, because after Socrates makes Meletus look silly, he ends up giving us an insight into what that original inversion that the old accusers accuse him of, what the content of that is. He ends up giving us an insight into what that inversion was. And there's this beautiful passage where he says something along the lines of, you Athenians, you're so worried and concerned about the accumulation of wealth, of money, of power, of status, of honor, but yet so little concerned about the development of the soul and of virtue. Are you not ashamed of this? And I think this is where we get the hint of why he was ridiculed, because this is where he explains what that inversion, that making the better appear the worse cause, what that means. So the old accusers, which he recognizes are the ones that are the most dangerous, while also at the same time recognizing that the new accusers are not really dangerous, right? These old accusers are saying that Socrates makes the good appear bad. And then Socrates tells us what the good here is. And the good here is the values of Athenian society. What Athenian society valued was money, power, status, honor, and virtue. The cultivation of the soul was maybe a secondary afterthought. He says, are you not ashamed of this, right? That you're prioritizing money and these things over the cultivation of the self and of virtue. This is an inversion. This gets the values that allow the Athenian social relations to reproduce themselves in the way that they reproduce themselves. This gets those values and inverts them. And this is why he's killed. He's killed because he challenges the ideological assumptions and normative assumptions specifically that are central in order for the sort of class society that we have in Athens to reproduce itself. In Athens at that moment, we have the recent return of democracy. A year or two before the Peloponnesian War had ended, and democracy was restored in Athens. And Athenian society, Athenian democracy, was something that only citizens participated in, which means that women were excluded, the youth was of course excluded, freed slaves were excluded, current slaves were excluded, and foreigners were excluded. So already within the citizen group you have a minority of the population. So those participating in that Athenian democracy was already not the general populace, but it was only men that pretty much had land. Now within the citizen group itself, those sharp class distinctions. We have a class, I believe in Greek is the aristoi, which is the traditional aristocratic class. This class owned most of the land, they owned most of the resources, they held most of the political offices, and the ideas of this class were the predominant ideas of the time, as is usually the case with the relation of the ruling economic power and the ruling ideological or the ruling ideas. There was also a sort of embryonic merchant class or a small developing bourgeois class that participated in trade and all of these other things, which by the time that Aristotle comes about, and this is a little bit of a sideline, but we're used to thinking of Plato as the communistic one and Aristotle as the conservative one, but this sort of merchant pseudo-bourgeois class that's beginning to develop by the time that Aristotle's writing, he's very critical of how they conduct business. There's a specific concept, chromatic circulation, and that's how he describes how they go into the market. They go into the market not to trade in order to get back things that they can use, and therefore in order to get back wealth in the form of use value, right? For Aristotle, if you had an instrument, say a flute, that you didn't know how to play, that instrument was valueless for you because you couldn't take advantage of its use value. So you would trade it for something else that you could use. These people were not participating in that sort of trade. They were participating in chromatic circulation for the sake of making money itself. So this gives us an insight into what we see in chapters 3 and 4 of Marx's Capital, right? The distinction between going into the market with a commodity to sell a commodity to buy another commodity versus going into the market with money to buy a commodity to increase the value, the use value of that commodity, to then sell the commodity at a dearer price and extract surplus value from that commodity that is done through that unpaid labor time. And Marx himself in those chapters cites Aristotle quite extensively in the footnotes. But to get back to the class dynamics in Athens, so you have this aristocratic class, you have this up-and-coming bourgeois class, and you have this other class of small landowners, a pseudo-peasant class, and this class constituted the majority of the citizenry, but they had very little influence in terms of political power and in terms of land ownership. Right, most of the land was controlled by the aristocracy, and the same was for the political power. So you have a struggle between the values of the aristocracy and this merchant class that's arising. And what are their values? Well, their values are wealth is the accumulation of money is good. It's a sign of goodness. The accumulation of power and political positions, higher up political positions, is a sign of a person's goodness, right? So the values that allow the values which arise out of these economic social relations are values which prioritize money, power, status. And Socrates challenges this, and he challenges this in an indiscriminate manner. He's talking to rich, he's talking to poor, he's talking to freed people or citizens, he's talking to slaves, he's even talking to women, as we see in dialogues such as the Symposium, where he gives basically the speech that he gives is what was her name? Let's see, I forgot her name, but Diotima, that's right. So he speaks indiscriminately with everyone, and he is slowly, through these dialogues with people, deconstructing the ruling values of Athenian society and reconstructing them according to a center that prioritizes human life and that prioritizes the ability of focusing on the development of virtue for that human life. So this is a transvaluation of values. He completely inverts the values in Athenian society that prioritize things such as money and power for the prioritization of human life and the cultivation of virtue. And this is an integrally social understanding of virtue. We don't necessarily get this from the Apology itself, but from texts like the Republic, which most centrally deals with virtues such as justice. We understand justice as a virtue that is both seen at the macro or political level and at the individual or micro level, and it's seen in the form of a structure. So it's a structural conception of virtue, of the virtue of justice, that is both in the political and in the individual. So when Socrates is talking about the cultivation of virtue, that is inextricably linked as well to the social, right, or to the political. So this is why he's killed, and this means that that there's not just a misunderstanding, because it's just so clear once you read the dialogue that the reason why he's killed is not because of religion. We can understand from that, or we can infer from that, that the misunderstanding has a purpose behind it. The purpose in misunderstanding it is that in a secular society such as ours, if we reduce the death of Socrates to religious reasons, Socrates remains as a figure who, sure, we study in Intro to Philosophy classes, but a figure whose relevance dies in 399 BCE. We don't live in a society that's governed by religion. Maybe in medieval society, a reading that reduced Socrates to a critic of religion might have been more radical. But today, to talk about the death of Socrates as having its source in his critique of religion is to castrate his radical message, to reduce his radicalism to a point that played a insignificant role in the reason why he's killed. And not only that he is consciously aware that it's not going to play a central role. So Socrates then, he's not someone who's calling for the overthrow of the aristocracy and for the installment of a workers' dictatorship, right? But he's someone who is actively challenging the root values which allow the smooth reproduction of Athenian social relations. And this is why he is killed. He is killed because he was creating, as a 70-year-old, a counter-hegemony which threatened the ruling economic interest which dominated the Athenian state, or the Athenian democracy. And the reading of his death must be recaptured by revolutionaries today, because his death was a revolutionary death, right? He stands in history as the figures of Jesus or Che Guevara do, that are folks who have died for the multitude, who have died with a strong sense of principle, who preferred to die before breaking their principles. And these are honorable characteristics, and characteristics that revolutionaries should generally have. But also as a figure who challenged the core of the existing order of his time, and who produced the sort of challenge that, in the same way as with Jesus, we can use his message, which criticized imperialism, which criticized wealth, and which urged the assistance of the poor. In the same way that we can use that message today in a revolutionary manner, in the same way in which we see that with liberation theologists and the Christian socialist movement, we can do the same with Socrates. Socrates provides stringent critiques of societies that are dominated by money, power, status, and what is modern bourgeois society if not an intensified and modernized form of the Athenian society that Socrates lived in, right? Both are societies structured or mediated through associations based on class, and in both cases, of course, the values that arise are the values of the ruling class, and these values are necessarily concerned to the material and economic interest of that ruling class. So recapturing the death of Socrates as a revolutionary death allows us to have within our repertoire the moral critique of the values that predominate modern bourgeois society, which are values that keep us as monadic individuals. I use monadic instead of atomized, which is something that most people use, because although atomized are simple elements, Monads come from the concept of Leibniz, and the special thing about monads is that Leibniz said they had no windows. So they exist in a non-causal relations with everything around them, but they're in harmony with everything around them by this predisposed order that comes from God. And capitalism today, or bourgeois society today, the relations between individuals are so separated, alienated, and disconnected that I think the concept of monad is a lot better of a concept to describe bourgeois individualism. It's the one that Marx uses early on, because there's this sort of separation, this non-causal relation between individuals. There's no connection, and besides, even though there is no connection, there's this sort of predisposed harmony by which these monadic individuals continue to participate in the constant reproduction of the existing relations. So we exist in a society today which Socrates' message and critiques of Athenian society still sustain as valid, and therefore his death is misinterpreted not just because of intellectual sloppiness, but for ideological reasons. In the same way that other revolutionary figures are whitewashed, Socrates, in my opinion, is another one of these figures that are whitewashed, because if you remove that whitewashed layer, you'll have a radical figure that can attack the existing values of capitalism, and doing so, especially with the spirit of Socrates, which is an inquisitive spirit, a critical spirit, that's always trying to analyze what is presupposed in this. What is presupposed? What is presupposed? What's behind this? Starting with that normative critique, you have the drive to get to deeper and deeper layers, and ultimately to an understanding that it is the economic relations in society out of which these values in bourgeois society arise. So through this normative critique, we can ultimately, if we dig deeper, come to understand that the source of the meaninglessness that we experience in bourgeois society today, the source of alienation, or what someone like Husserl would call the crisis of meaning, if we go deep enough, we find that the crisis of meaning, that the devaluation of human life, is at the core of the society. It is in the level in which humans reproduce those things that are necessary for the society and the people in the society to survive. This is where the rot is. It's at the core. And because it's rotten at the core is why we're able to see in society, in superstructural institutions and ideas, we're able to see the rot there and the devaluation of human life there, only because the core itself is rotten. So although it's very easy to produce critiques of the culture, I think that recapitulating or bringing back, resuscitating the death of Socrates, which was a revolutionary death, and doing so with his same inquisitive and questioning and critical philosophical spirit, allows us to bring one more thinker in the collection of the greatest minds in history, who would be extremely critical of our society today, and who would have the drive necessary to understand that the root of the rot is in the economic system and in our social relations and the relations of production. So Socrates belongs to us. Socrates belongs to the revolutionaries. His death and his legacy is ours. We're the ones that are keeping his legacy alive. It is not an academia that serves as bourgeois idealists and as representatives and fabricators of the ideals of bourgeois society. His death does not belong to an academia that has had to generationally castrate the meaning behind his death in order to make him absorbable by class society. His death and his legacy belongs to us, to revolutionaries fighting in his spirit for a world that prioritizes human life instead of money, power, and status. So this is Carlos Garrido. If you want to read my article, I would have that linked in the description below. So this is Carlos Garrido from Midwestern Marx signing out. Thanks for watching.